Let me say good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Certainly for those who are present with us, those who will be watching and viewing online. I'm Canon Missioner Leonard Hamlin here at the Washington National Cathedral. And on behalf of our Dean Randy Hollerith, as well as the Bishop of the Washington Diocese, it gives me great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this afternoon's symposium. Those who have gathered and those who are watching know that this symposium is part of a larger effort, our windows replacement effort, where the cathedral is engaged upon replacing windows that were placed into the cathedral in memory, of course, of General Lee, General Stonewall Jackson. All of the issues that were related to these windows and have been brought up by these windows have given us an opportunity to engage in this program and this effort that we have entitled Light in the Darkness. And so as we are taking and making great effort to tell a richer and fuller story, to make sure that representation is rich and full here at the cathedral, we're grateful for this opportunity to engage in dialogue, discussions, presentations, and in many would say symposiums and forums. All of these are needed so that we might be able to not just reflect upon the past, but also to reflect upon and have vision for the future. And so we're thankful for those that are present, look forward to hearing from those who will be viewing. And on this day, as we have come, we know that we will be engaging in this wonderful presentation. But before I introduce our presenter who has gathered with us today for this afternoon symposium, won't you join me in a word of prayer? Almighty, as we come, we are so ever grateful for this moment in time, this moment that is connected to moments throughout time, time that we have experienced, time that we are experiencing, and time that will yet to come. We pray now that what we might do now might be able to link together those things that we are seeking even greater understanding of, that we may be able to have greater actions in the future. Make us one on this day. We thank you for what has been, what is, and in advance we say thank you for what shall be. So we ask now that you would do this, and in your wonderful name we pray this prayer. Amen. As we gather in this symposium and in this moment, as has been entitled Religion and History, America's Struggle with Racialized Symbolism, I'm thankful that we're going to hear from a wonderful presenter on today. I have had opportunity, and many of you have perhaps looked and have seen her bio, but I've had opportunity to work with this presenter recently and throughout the years, and I'm grateful not just for her information, I'm grateful for her passion. Thankful for her education, but I'm thankful for her commitment. And so as she comes today to enlighten us, to stir us, to present before us, the presentation has been titled, of course, Changing Optics for Racial Justice, the Nexus Between Responsibility and Opportunity. This is a moment where we have gathered, not just so that we might gather more information, but we might be encouraged to take action because we all have responsibility. So our presenter for today, Dr. Sabrina Dent, serves as the president as the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation in Richmond, Virginia. She's been a lifelong advocate for human rights and social justice. Her work and her scholarship addresses religious freedom issues that impact African American and marginalized communities in ways that undermine their civil rights and their social needs. Her presentation this afternoon is entitled Changing Optics for Racial Justice, the Nexus Between Responsibility and Opportunity. On this day, I hope that you will receive her, and we look forward to hearing from her. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's talk as we look at changing optics for racial justice, the nexus between responsibility and opportunity. And I want to thank my friend, Reverend Dr. Leonard Hamlin, for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation today. So thank you. We have the title of today's topic, which is Changing the Optics for Racial Justice, the Nexus Between Responsibility and Opportunity. But I want to hone in on the fact that this topic really covers the impact of racialized iconography in public and sacred spaces on minority communities. It pushes me to raise the question, in America, why have religious ideals become more important than the plight of humanity? I raise the problem is this. We, as members of faith communities, have a tendency to minimize the trauma of systemic oppression suffered among racial, cultural, and ethnic minority groups by primarily focusing on the insensitivities imposed on people with religiously different identities instead of divesting in legalized immoral policies and hierarchical practices or white privilege that threaten the plight of humanity, because it is easier to address spiritual freedom than human dignity. But I also believe that the solution is found in the problem that I stated. We as members of faith communities must acknowledge that authentic spiritual freedom requires human dignity by modeling compassion in practical ways through policy changes while learning from our personal and historical narratives that find us in common bonds as a community. Today, the Washington National Cathedral is the second largest building in the United States and the third tallest building in the District of Columbia. This massive and well-sculpted edifice is most notably described as being in the most commanding spot. When one walks through the cathedral, there is a story being told everywhere you look. On the walls, in the tapestry, the ceilings, the doors, and windows. Each piece tells a story of the cathedral, religion, and our nation. As one steps onto the human rights porch, they are introduced to notable figures such as Mother Teresa, Rosa Parks, Jonathan Daniels, Elie Wiesel, Bishop John Walker, and many others who use their power and influence to address societal ills in the forms of many racial injustices, apartheid, human and civil rights concerns, among other issues. Their presence in this sacred and public space sets the tone for the story that the Washington National Cathedral wants to tell as a house of prayer for all people. Entering the sanctuary, one cannot miss the 7-foot statue of America's first president, in the George Washington Bay. As noted in the book, Jewels of Light, the stained glass of Washington National Cathedral, at certain times of the day, light streams from the Robert Penart's window, founding of a new nation, illuminating vivid colors, bringing a blend of visual and emotional sensations. Depending on who's viewing this imagery, the emotional response could range from feelings of pride, patriotism, and hope, whereas for others, it may unearth feelings of pain, anguish, and the complexities of what it means to be an American. It could be that it's the same nauseating complexity that many people witnessed on January 6, 2021, as our nation's capital was attacked in a coup attempt. That moment revealed the worst of America's legacy, which upholds white male patriarchy, Christian nationalism, racism, and everything that seeks to disrupt the expansion of beliefs and identities of what it means to be American. Diversity of voice, identity, and experience are critical in addressing issues about racial justice, religious freedom, and human rights. Yet the unspoken hierarchy of white privilege and white supremacy is ever present in how we operate in society, identify and celebrate American heroes, and even create public policies which impact communities that are governed. As stated by former United States presidential candidate Shirley Chisholm, racism is so universal in the country, so widespread and deep-seated, that it is invisible because it is so normal. To mindfully address the impact of racism and racialized iconography on minority communities in public and sacred spaces, such as the Cathedral, one should consider the words of African-American journalist, orator, and author Ida B. Wells, who said, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." Wells' words serve as a reminder that in this moment, there is a responsibility and opportunity to focus our lens by changing the optics for racial justice in a world that often seems disconnected from the atrocities and sufferings of historically marginalized groups. As a Black woman who stands tall on the shoulders of many strong women in history, such as Anna Julia Cooper, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Joanna Lee, there's an even greater emphasis on the moral, spiritual, and social responsibility to be a voice and an advocate in bridging that gap that divides us as a nation. This paper will explore the detrimental effects of history being told from a limited scope and perspective, which too often diminishes the experiences of racial and religious minority groups at the expense of their dignity. Therefore, it would highlight the hypocrisy of a nation that has continuously blurred the lines of church-state separation for its own benefit. While it is important to unapologetically address the harsh realities of racism and social injustices, it is equally befitting for faith communities to push the boundaries for necessary, uncomfortable, and honest dialogue about our nation, which opens a door for greater awareness, for love, understanding, and justice for all humanity. The key is understanding the word responsibility. That is, as a state or fact, or having the duty to deal with something, or having control over something. That is, the state of being accountable for something. History in America must be taught through a more critical and comprehensive way. The Cathedral's Racial Justice Windows Project provides one way to illuminate how the sins of America, that is, church and state, have denied the sanctity of Black life from birth through death. As expressed by the Dean of the Cathedral, the very Reverend Randolph Marshall Hollerith, the old windows were a barrier to our mission, an impediment to worship in this place, and they had no place being in sacred space. With the announcement of renowned African-American artist Carrie James Marshall and poet Elizabeth Alexander being selected to construct a new visual narrative, identity, and purpose for the cathedral in profound measures that renew its commitment to justice and reconciliation, this is the moment for all who are gathered to lean in to discerning postures, to understand more why we need to change the optics for religious justice, racial justice, religious justice too. So we're going to look at the scope of a flawed foundation. Changing our optics for racial justice in the context of this space requires that we re-examine historical moments, decisions, and give them new meaning to understand the connection between truth-telling as responsibility and opportunity. This requires that we execute moral courage and imagination as we enter the cathedral with a new vision of living into our purpose as people of faith and goodwill. In 2022, what does it mean to enter this sacred and public space, given the weight of the nation and founders' contribution to domestic terrorism in the form of slavery and legalized racism? How do we begin to lean into the work of justice in ways that dismantle theological ideas of Christian nationalism and promote the liberation of all people? To simply start, speak the truth. In 1791, President George Washington commissioned Major Pierre L'Enfant to create a visionary plan for the nation's capital. It was L'Enfant who first imagined a great church for national purposes. Then in 1893, Congress granted a charter to the Protestant Episcopal Cathedral Foundation of the District of Columbia, identifying it as the national church for the promotion of religion and education and charity. But for whom was this institution really built? Recall in history, on September 17th, 1791, 41 of the 55 state delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention to conclude the process of writing the initial blueprint for America's system of governing. They represented different generations and backgrounds, and in their minds, different countries. Each state was seen as its own independent country. And this could still be observed today when you look at the inconsistency of public policies and laws that protect some and criminalize others. To that state, these delegates pledged their allegiance, and they boldly took issue with the idea of being united. But all were white men who met secretly in closed quarters to discuss agendas and ideas that would shape a divided nation. The three main issues that would be addressed would be: how would the president be elected, the Electoral College, the slave trade, human freedom, the Bill of Rights, that is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, including the freedom of religion. These were all controversial issues that led to very heated debates by elected state representatives who would become the founding framers. This moment in American history gave birth to the United States Constitution that will become the written supreme law of the land. This Constitution outlined how and who would govern the country. It set the foundation and structure for America's malignant way of functioning. In 2021, the book, African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities, was published by a group of 9 African American scholars, faith leaders, organizers, and citizens, with a commitment to amplifying and addressing the complexities of race and religion in the United States. The book is a collection of essays examining how and in what ways African Americans have navigated the contested terrain of religious freedom in America. These essays present novel interpretations of religious freedom critically informed by African American culture, history, ideas, and religious experiences. In Chapter 3, Dr. Eric L. Williams, curator of religion at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, wrote, "One of the most gruesome tales ever told in the history of the modern world is that of the African presence on the continent of North Africa. For it was in Virginia, 1619, within the bowels of hell, of what would soon become the institution of North American chattel slavery, that the black body would become subject to a premier site of violence in the New World. The sheer brutality of the physical violence visited upon Africans and their descendants, torture, maiming, beating, rape, and killing, while enduring forced labor, placed the enslaved in a state that can arguably be described as natal alienation and social death. The experiences of enslaved Africans and their descendants in the United States has always been at the mercy of the ruling majority. One poignant example of such is the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln on September 22, 1862. The freedom of enslaved communities was based not so much on their liberation as valued human beings, but as an ultimatum issued to the rebellious states during the Civil War if they did not join the Union. Only then would the enslaved be set free on January 1st, 1863. Whereas Juneteenth is now officially recognized as a holiday in the United States, imagine for a moment what it means for your existence to be a constant struggle for freedom in every way. In the context of the Cathedral's Racial Justice Window Project, what does it mean to remove windows from a sacred and public space that idealizes Confederate soldiers who fought tirelessly to oppose the freedom that compelled over 200,000 Black men to fight for a nation that did not affirm their humanity? The answers have been addressed in many interviews since the announcement in September of 2021. Reverend Marshall Hollerith said, "This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the Cathedral to not only create beautiful art, but to stake a claim about what and who we value." Thus, I want to visualize this question through the lens of optics, that is light and perception. Light is the only external source of energy on our planet. It is vital to everything that we need and to live and survive. Optics is the scientific study of light and its behavioral patterns, or the properties of transmission and deflection of other forms of radiation. It describes how light interacts with other matter. Coincidentally, optics is also defined by Merriam-Webster Dictionary as the aspects of an action, policy, or decision, as in politics or business, that relate to public perceptions. This translates to mean that any decision that you make concerning a sacred and public space will be subject to public opinion, reflection, and analysis by those who are welcomed or engaged in that space. Thus, the iconography and imagery on display suggests as much about the institution, its ideals and beliefs or values held by those in positions of authority within that space. For that reason, it should be understood that the decision of the Cathedral leadership to remove the windows in 2017 after the murders of the Charleston Nine at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina in 2015 and the white supremacist attacks in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 embraces the changing optics for religious justice, for racial justice that caused them to a place of moral responsibility as not only authors of the narrative, but caregivers for the faith community. In the book Jewels of Light, the Stained Glass of Washington National Cathedral, it is noted that the cathedral's earliest spiritual custodians saw stained glass windows as connections with the divine, expressions of the fineness of human aspirations to honor God by creating luminous beauty that sings his praises in notes of vibrant color. This description raises two significant observations on opportunity. That is, to choose wisely what story you want to tell and how you want the story told. There are implications for the choices that we make. In looking at the impacts of race and racism on minority communities, we have to understand that race is not about biological differences. As Melvin Oliver stated in the PBS documentary Race, the Power of Illusion, race in itself means nothing, but the markers of race, skin color, hair texture, and the things we identify as racial markers mean nothing unless they're given social meaning. And unless there's public policy and private actions that act upon those kind of characteristics that create race. Essentially, it's the laws and the practices that impact a group's opportunities that determine race. The evidence of this truth resonates in many of the citizenship cases that were brought before the circuit and Supreme Courts in the United States. In the book, White by Law, The Legal Construction of Race, by Ian F. Haney Lopez, he writes in detail about the citizenship case of Ozawa, Mr. Takawa Ozawa, in the case Ozawa versus the United States. When the Supreme Court decided that the term white persons referred to those who were popularly or commonly known as the Caucasian race. The acknowledgement of this fact confirms that Alan Bozak's critique of a less than progressive government, and just so you know, Alan Bozak is a South African activist and faith leader that protested apartheid in South Africa. That this acknowledgement and his critique of a less than progressive government and society that values the lives of those who have been oppressed and marginalized in history speaks volumes, and ultimately it raises the question of ethics in politics and public life. This is strongly witnessed in the writings of Thomas McCullough. He challenged the ethics of public policy by raising the questions about value systems implemented by politicians, leaders, economists, and individuals that impact how communities are often mishandled. The interrogations that he poses require a more critical examination of how moral decisions are made and how moral imagination is paramount in that process. In 1991, McCullough wrote in his book, The Moral Imagination and Public Life Raising Questions, when will there be a democratic uprising in the United States of America? Collective actions will be required in order to solve the problems of environmental pollution, healthcare, unemployment, poverty, and homelessness. Who will initiate this action? How will the decision be made? Will they be just, and will they preserve and enhance the common good? Nearly 30 years later, we witnessed this uprising with the January 6th riots and the various rallies where organizations such as the Poor People's Campaign and Faithful Democracy continue to fight for health care, livable wages, and peacefully protest their immoral practices and unethical legislation in the form of voter suppression by government officials that threaten the survival of Americans. Thus answering McCullough's question of who will initiate this action, I say the collective community of people, religious or not, who are driven by morality and ethics. I recognize that this presentation barely scratches the surface of the issues that faith communities must confront and deliberate when it comes to changing the optics of racial justice as a priority. The Cathedral's efforts to host these public conversations, in addition to replacing the windows, give space for all of us to ask questions about our individual, communal, and institutional responsibility to advance issues of justice and reconciliation in the public square. In closing, there are a few recommendations that offer practical solutions to the Cathedral staff in reshaping the narrative and identity of this house of prayer for all people. First, Elevate the stories of the cathedral windows, such as the agony of civil war. Tell the significance of this brutal period in history that created generations of trauma, not only for America, but descendants of enslaved and freed Africans. In Rebecca Chasen's article, African American Culture and Trauma, she proposes that any effort to understand African American experience requires serious critique of the numerous institutions and structures in the United States that produce unequal outcomes and trauma for people of color. These include, again, access to health care, education, transportation, employment, affordable and suitable housing, issues that are often minimized and unaddressed, even in the midst of a global pandemic. Furthermore, Chasen asserts that racial microaggressions commonly held practices, behaviors, and perspectives such as silencing, discounting, and colorblindness, and the minimization of racial cultural issues and cultural insensitivity serve as reminders of racism. For those that don't know, a microaggression is a subtle or offensive comment directed towards a minority or marginalized group that unintentionally reinforces a stereotype. Second, I offer to the cathedral staff to keep learning. Articles such as Traumatization in the Name of Religion by Charmin Claire McCreary DeMoss are important in highlighting how many horrific individual and group actions have been committed in the name of religion and contribute to the traumatization of racial and religious minority groups. The polarity of race and religion intersect in such literature by clarifying how religions and some practitioners' claims that God is on their side creates the perception that the other side is evil. While this research seeks to highlight the importance of changing optics for racial justice as a responsibility and opportunity, it primarily focuses on addressing the moral implications of controversial social beliefs that threaten human dignity and peaceful coexistence. Accordingly, faith and community leaders must hold the government accountable for unethical and immoral policies that endanger the basic survival of its citizens. Exemplify the power of storytelling as a sociological approach to creating positive engagement and understanding. In sharing their narratives and engaging in dialogue, people of faith and moral conscience can bridge the gap of understanding as it relates to social beliefs and racial bias by modeling compassion, which is frequently conflated in the work of justice. From these experiences, individuals are presented with the possibilities to grow into compassionate communities that exhibit culture and religious literacies that benefit humanity. Finally, I suggest to take action. In 2021 alone, there were concerted efforts across the country where 34 laws in 19 different states were enacted that restricted access to the ballot box. This has major implications for communities of color, college students, and people with disabilities. On a larger scale, it impacts who has power and influence over local, state, and federal budgets and government. For me, it's important that in 2022, faith communities have a responsibility to continue holding our elected officials accountable to their moral obligation to serve we the people. People of faith and moral conscience must be intentional in their efforts to include all voices. We must be compassionate listeners who are willing to take risks to advocate for those who are challenged by privilege and sit on the margins in life. and we must collaborate with others who are doing the work. My final closing remarks to you, I want to borrow from the words of Angela Davis in her speech at Bogazici University in Istanbul, Turkey on January 9th, 2015. She said, "We have to do something extraordinary. We have to go to great lengths. We cannot go on as usual. We cannot pivot the center. We cannot be moderate. We will have to be willing to stand up and say no with our combined spirits, our collective intellects, and our many bodies." For me, this is how we begin to change the optics on racial justice in America. Thank you.
Then if you could just stay right there for just a second. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Dent for the presentation to get us started along this journey that we know that we're all taking in the replacement of the windows as well as conversations in relationship. And so before we break for just a few moments and allow time, just in terms of conversation that we might address, and there might be some here, give an opportunity for questions if you'd like to pose them for Dr. Dent, as well as any question you'd like to raise. But I'd like to raise one that I really found very interesting as you talked about the relationship between spiritual freedom and human dignity. And that kind of space between the two. And I just would like to ask, could you say just a little bit more about your thinking on that? Because when we think of all that we're seeking to do at this moment that you were really laying out so clearly in the replacement of the windows and the issues that are there, that space, what is the church missing, or why did that ring out? Because I love the way that you put that in relationship with each other.
Yes, that's a great question. So when I think of the founding of this country, I think of the realities that the founding framers were really fighting for religious freedom for all people. At the same time, one of the things that I didn't highlight as much in this presentation is the reality that those founding framers were also slave-holding individuals. And so for me, how can you fight for the freedom for someone to believe or not to believe in something, and not fight for the existence of a person, for their humanity, the right for them to live and to thrive as a human being, and to practice their own spiritual freedom? Because what people have to remember is that from those that were brought from the continent of Africa to the Americas, that 30% of those individuals identified as Muslim. There were people that came from African traditions and spirituality. So, but they were stripped of that when they were brought to the Americas, and also remembering the fact that they were dispersed around the world. So people don't talk about that as much, about how they were dispersed, not just to the Caribbean, but also to Asia. So it's important for me that we talk about the reality that people feel comfortable talking about religion and religious identity. But when it comes to matters of human freedom, the right to live, to be, to thrive, to exist, to love who you choose to love, that there is problematic. And so it's like we have to talk about, like, what does that mean? If you profess, for those that profess a faith that says that everyone is made in the image and likeness of God, then why is that not applicable when it comes to public policies, when it comes to the theologies and ideologies that affirm the dignity of a person? So for me, it's important to highlight that, because there is a distinction when you're looking at a person's whole being and how they're able to show up. And keep in mind, even I didn't point out in this presentation, because the way I shaped it, is that we have to remember that there was also the slave Bible, right? So, enslaved people were given this Bible that had passages cut out of it that spoke to their liberation as people, but the passages that were left in there were the ones that told them to slaves obey your master, right? The ones that put them in more bondage. So now you're creating this false sense of Christianity and religion to oppress a group of people by fear and coercion. So I think that is important to raise that in the conversation. And thinking about it in terms of the future is that as the imagery and the iconography is being imagined, remembering those stories and remembering also the complexities that come with religious identity, but also the diversity of identities among, I want to say, the Black community, that everyone is not of one particular tradition, but there is diversity in that as well. And that story needs to be told.
There is so much that you're lifting and that you've already lifted. I could probably dig into it, just in case there are other pieces. Because as you tie in as well with theology, I appreciate what you said about the Bible, hearing and growing up. And we've all heard that wonderful statement that has said, sometimes the only Bible that people will read will be what they see in you. And I wonder now, by hearing your presentation, what is being left out? Just by what you said. Let me ask, are there particular questions or that from here as well that anyone wants to lift or point out? Yes.
What do you do with the white church that won't really recognize Jonathan Daniels? I'm amazed at how he's ignored, but also won't recognize the authenticity of the Black church and freedom teachings, and then recognize that the white church manipulated the Bible to cut out portions for their own self-serving motives. What are you going to do with an organization like that?
Right. That's a very difficult question to respond to, because in the work that I've been fortunate to do and engage on dialogue, one of the things that we say about dialogue is that you have to come into it with a healthy sense of curiosity. And so to engage a group of people that are not willing to be open to hear another perspective or another reality or truth makes it very difficult to even go down that road. But I really believe that there is a possibility for change to happen person by person as you get to know an individual and get to know their narrative. And that's the long haul. That's the long haul of it. There's a lot of education that still needs to happen around the contributions of even those that were, I think of like not only the abolitionists, but also Quakers that contributed to the freedom of enslaved Africans, but really also helping people to understand those narratives are just as important. So what you're asking is very challenging because it's playing out right now in the public square as to those who are not willing to listen to a narrative that is different. I often raise in other conversations, I show an image of the events from January 6th. And I say to people, what does this image look like to a person that is an immigrant, someone that is non-religious, that's a person of color, that's a religious minority? What does this image say to them? What does it say about this country? Because keeping in mind the imagery of what we saw on that day is we saw anti-Semitic messaging, we saw Jesus Save signs, we saw nooses, and then we also learned from watching, for those that did watch the hearings, that some of those were specifically directed towards certain individuals as well. So it's hard to really engage a group of people that are not willing to listen. But I really believe that person by person, that we're able to make that change. Now, is that something that's going to happen overnight? not necessarily. Is that something that's going to happen in my lifetime? I don't know. I believe that it is possible. I hope that change happens, but the reality of it is we have, there are generations of people that have been raised to believe the way that they believe, and they choose not. It's intentional. They choose not to do so. Dr. James Henry Harris, who's a professor at the Samuel D. Proctor School of Theology, talks about, he has a quote where he says that evil is a human invention. And so people choose to make the decisions that they make. Change can happen if people want it to. And that's, again, I can't say it enough, that's unfortunately what we see happening in the public square. So, but it also takes willing conversation partners that are afraid, and I say afraid, meaning there are some white people that want to engage in dialogue but don't know how to begin. There are some. And so the thing is for us to have an open heart, open mind, to be willing to have those conversations. It's not my responsibility to teach you everything, because just like you can go on Google and Google everything else, you can also Google history and information to be a better informed person. But it's a long haul. It's a long haul work that needs to happen. But it takes people like you who's here to then share information that enlightens others. And I said this, the last thing in response to your question, I'll say this. I shared with, on Sunday, I had the honor of speaking with an all-white faith community. And I shared with that community that the moral crisis that we see in America today is when good-meaning, well-intentioned people don't speak up and take action. Silence says a lot.
Additional questions?
But I just wanted to add to your point that you were saying with the January 6th thing. You mentioned other things, but more important is that that group of people felt that they would kill other people and murder other people, and that it was patriotism. And so to me, that is very troubling. So where do you go from there? There are a lot of people who do believe that they were doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this narrative continues. So I know what you're saying, but how do you get beyond that? Because everybody saw that. And you had people in Congress who were assisting them to do, showed them the passageway. They were even going to murder the vice president because they didn't go along with it. So where are we? Are we in 200 years before? Or we're in the current state? And the whole world is looking on and then ignorant by itself, saying a coup took place in America. And then America tells everybody what they should be doing, they should be doing this. This is that's how a democracy works, or is this a democracy?
That's a great comment and a great question. Is it a democracy, right? I use sometimes the language of perceived democracy, because it's perceived to be a democracy, but it's not quite a democracy. At the same time, what you raised about what the world witnessed, not just the United States, right? What the world witnessed. I had an international friend to share with me their hardship and their pain for what they saw happen, because they said, America dictates to the world and models for the world what they should do. And so there were great concerns about it. So it points to the domestic as well as the international concerns that come up of the events that happened on January 6th. But as I responded to this gentleman here, I said, that work, when you have people that ascribe to such beliefs as Christian nationalism, which Christian nationalism is a specific ideology where people believe that what it means to be American means that you have to be Christian or ascribe to those ideas, and you have to be patriotic. But the problem, the additional problem to that is, the display of Christian nationalism that took place in the chambers, right? Like they prayed. So they also, in their minds, felt like this was the will of God for them to take over. And so again, education, speaking up. Again, I can't say it enough that when well-intentioned people are silent about issues, then that's when things happen and people seem to be okay or think that things are okay, but it's not. We have to tell our narratives. We have to tell our stories. Storytelling is so powerful, but also contacting your elected officials is also a very powerful way to do so.
All right, yes, I'm from Virginia, and we're seeing the wave go the other way. How do you tell the truth with stories, particularly teachers in public schools, when the law comes against them for teaching the truth because it might be upsetting? Of course it's upsetting, it's the truth. And I don't know how to push back on that. They're terrifying teachers from doing their job, teaching the truth.
Right. I would say this. I live in Virginia as well. So I was disheartened with many of the executive orders that came forward, and also especially HB 787. And not to be political, but all of this is political. But that particular piece of legislation that made it illegal for teachers to teach certain things about the truth of history. So in those cases, and I actually did, personally speaking, I showed up virtually for the hearing, and I tried to speak truth in that hearing. One of the things that I pointed out is that it's important for us to tell all of history, right? Because you can't talk about the civil rights movement and you can't talk about certain issues without raising how we got to where we are in America. One of those things that I raised in sharing was the story of Evelyn Thomas Butts. I don't know how many of you know who she is. Good. That's good.
I'm from Virginia.
Are you? Okay, great. Not too many people know who she is. She's the African American woman that sued the governor because she had to pay polling taxes, and she said that it violated her 14th Amendment constitutional right. That's not taught in the history books, right? But yet students hear about polling taxes. So it is important for us to tell history, but also I say lean on the resources that are the experts. So what did I do? I pulled in the recommendations of the National Council for Social Studies and said, this is how they say to teach about history in public schools. I'm gonna be honest, in this moment, I know this is being recorded, it didn't get me very far because they did not acknowledge me on the call. I submitted my comments early because I wasn't sure if I was going to make it at a 7 a.m. I think it was 7 a.m. meeting, which is ridiculous if you want parents to weigh in on things. But I think what we have to do as citizens, for me, is to remember history, remember policy, remember, and we're not going to necessarily know all policies, right? But those things that are important to us, it's about doing the research and then finding those things that point to the answer that we need to provide a different narrative as to why things need to be taught the way they should be taught in public schools. Because we can't say that all these communities, that Black, Indigenous, and Latino, and Mexican American communities, and Japanese communities just suffered all these atrocities and experiences for no reason, right? There are moments in history that point to our experiences. So we need to be able to tell our children and to be able to support educators. Because the thing is, I believe there are a great number of educators that want to speak the truth, but are concerned about losing their jobs. And so they need the support of community members to say, we support you, we have your back, that we, I think it takes the work of all of us to do that. And it takes us writing the elected officials. I can't say that enough, especially in the state of Virginia with everything that is happening, that we have to make concerted efforts to do that. And don't feel like you have to do it by yourself, right? Get a group of friends to write letters, to call. This pivots just a little bit, but after the events that happened in Buffalo and Uvalde, one of the things that I did personally was, as a mother of a school-age child, it pained me to know that these babies should still be alive. It pained me to see people say that they were offering thoughts and prayers and felt like that's all they had to do. I'm like, call your elected official. So I called mine. And I told them why it was important to protect our children. And the thing is, here's the other thing. Those that have a different narrative or perspective of what I'm talking about today, they are well organized in doing that work. They are well organized. So we who are people of faith and moral conscience and goodwill need to be just as determined and organized to do the same. And the same thing, to bring it back to the Windows Project, right? Because that's why we're here, is to make sure that those of us that experience different narratives from what the mainstream continues to put out there, that we share those narratives, that we speak those truths unapologetically. Because to not tell the history of any one group in history undermines their existence. And that's not what we want to do. Not those of us that are part of goodwill, moral conscience communities.
Dr. Dent has gotten the foundation laid. We want to be able to take a quick transition, quick 5 minutes, so that we would move to our next presenters. But I want to say thank you to Dr. Dent for this presentation, and where we're going along this journey. And so as we look forward to taking it up further, it is about taking action. You reminded us that the art, the iconography, and the monuments that we say, they tell stories. Mm-hmm. And that intersection with our faith, the storytelling, we have to make sure that we're telling it correctly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we say thank you. Mm-hmm. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll bring up our next presenter.
Thank you.